Thank you so much. Good afternoon to you all. My name is Maeve McMahon and I'm a reporter here in Brussels. I've been around the town for the last 10 years or so. So I'm very excited to be part of this event. And for me as a reporter, I really feel that we should be putting social inequality and poverty and these issues at the top of our agenda every day. They should be the headlines in our news bulletins in the afternoons, and they're not. So I'm really pleased to see that you've taken the last couple of days to address these issues, and of course looking ahead to the recovery that the EU has set out for itself between 21 and 2027. So for this session that looks into that next generation EU package, I am delighted to be joined by Thomas DERMINE. He's the State Secretary for Scientific Policy, the Recovery Programme and Strategic Investments at the Belgian Federal Government. So Thomas DERMINE, good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for being with us. How's your day going so far?
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be with you. It's going well. Hopefully the sun will be back in Brussels in the coming days. Now it's a very busy period with the end of the lockdown, but it's also a very important period for Europe. So I hope that we'll be able to cover these important issue in the discussion.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, that's what it's all about, and the floor will be yours for the next 30 minutes. And of course, near the end of the discussion, our viewers and those participants are more than welcome to share their thoughts as well, or their remarks or their questions, of course, in the box that they can access right there. So I guess, Thomas, you're from Charleroi. I think you were born and raised in Charleroi, but you kind of commute now into Brussels and stuff. Can you just describe a day in the life of yours?
Well, I'm a state secretary in Belgium, so responsible for recovery, but also scientific policy. I live indeed in Charleroi, which is roughly an hour away from Brussels. And my most important mission is to be the father of two wonderful girls. So my days are pretty hectic, and I have a little baby of 3 months old. So my days start very early.
Congratulations.
And finish very late. So it's a very important mission we have in the government, but it's also a very important mission I have at home. So it's busy days.
Well, chapeau, hats off to you juggling it all. And I guess when you are creating policies, you're thinking of your two beautiful little daughters and the future that you want to bring about for them. So I guess really, like, in order for our participants and our viewers to get to know you a little bit more, tell us a little bit how the pandemic has impacted your work, because of course it has pretty much overshadowed, it's getting late, overshadowed, I mean, your time, of course, in your position there as Minister of Strategic Investments. So how have you kind of adapted both personally and of course professionally?
I would say it has impacted our work at 3 different levels. First of all, I would say 80% of the bandwidth of the government is dedicated to the crisis. 2 or 3 months ago, it was exclusively how to mitigate the sanitary consequences of the crisis. Now it's switching to the recovery and the support to specific industries. Secondly, it has impacted the way we work as a government. Politics in Belgium, but I think it's the same in other member states, used to work in a very old-fashioned way. I mean, it was not possible to do any parliamentary session through video chat. And so we had to adjust and to adapt in a very limited number of weeks, and in that way we've done tremendous spring ahead in the last few months. And the last and thirdly, it has also created new policy space. For example, I'm responsible for recovery in the government. It's a competence that did not exist in the previous government. So how we see the mission of the government has also changed depending on the crisis.
Okay, and I saw there you took to Twitter a couple of weeks ago, I think it was the 30th of April, with a number of your colleagues. You were all wearing your masks, but I could very much see behind those masks, you were all smiling, because you were very proud to be one of the first EU member states to get in that recovery plan into the European Commission.
Yeah, so in Belgium it was a real challenge, because as you know, in Belgium it's always a bit difficult to form and to get a new government. So we had election in May 2019. It took us more than a year actually to get a government at the federal level. And so we started this entire process of drafting the recovery and resilience plan later. We started only in late October. And in Belgium, we have a pretty bad track record in delivering in the drafting of these plans. So I remember one of the first meetings we had with the team of the Commission telling us that actually it would be quite difficult to comply with the deadline of end April. And so it was a bit of a rush, but I had the chance to have wonderful colleagues, very good, and to also get excellent support from the teams of the Commission to be able to comply with the deadline.
Okay, so that's why you had the smiling eyes and the smiles behind the masks. And were you smiling also about the content? I mean, I've seen a couple of various articles saying that, you know, Belgium ticks when it comes to the climate targets and etc. Can you talk us a little bit through the content of the recovery plan for Belgium?
Yeah, so I believe that the coronavirus crisis will be remembered in history as a big health crisis, as a big pandemic, with very deep socio-economic consequences. But I hope that it will be also remembered for our kids and for my two daughters as a defining moment in which we actually realize that we need to invest more and to invest in our future, to build a society which is actually more resilient for the future. So our plan is indeed, I believe, one of the most green among the member states. We have this minimum amount of 37% green tagging. I think that we slightly exceeded this minimal amount also for the digital tagging of the project. I would say, to make it very simple, our plan is 60% infrastructure which is required to make the sustainable and the digital transition, 15% research and development, and then the remainder is human capital investment and ICT investment in the digitization of public administration.
Okay, and I guess one thing is the plans and the other thing is the implementation. I guess the three themes or the main threads of this conference really, is how this next generation EU plan will tackle, for example, youth unemployment and bringing about a gender equality driven recovery, and also, of course, how it will inspire entrepreneurship, which of course is extremely important. Can you talk us through perhaps the first point, that of youth unemployment? Because so many young people have been impacted over the last year and a half with that pandemic. So many young people relying, of course, on jobs in tourism or in the hospitality sector or in the beauty sector. A lot have just been sitting at home twiddling their thumbs and waiting really for this opening up again, which of course now here in Belgium where we are is gradually happening, but it's been slow and it's been tough.
Yeah, indeed, and I think it's the case in all member states, but especially in Belgium. Some of the inequalities that we had been observing for years and years have been exacerbated by the crisis. It's the case for social inequalities, but it's also the case for generational inequalities. I think what's important with these plans is to remember that those plans are investment plans. And part of the issue of social inequalities cannot be addressed only by investment, but also by structural measures to promote social inclusiveness. And so this government in Belgium is of course doing a lot of things in the investment plan, but it has also taken very important measure to strive against poverty and more specifically among poverty for the young people. But for investments, what we've done is that we have invested massively in renovating buildings for students. So the question of housing for students is a big question in Belgium. So we have invested in this kind of buildings, renovating buildings dedicated for young people. We have also invested in training facilities because we have a lot of actually sectors who are short of workers. Everything which is related to the green transition, everything which is related to the green transition. So we are to the digital transition. So we're investing massively in training capabilities for the young people. And especially if I take, for example, the question of infrastructure, I mentioned that 60% of our plan is infrastructure. So basically, it will be a huge boost for the construction sector in Belgium. So it's of course now a big challenge on how do we make this an opportunity for young people, especially young unemployed persons. And in Belgium, we have some regions, including my hometown, where we have a big issue with structural unemployment of young people. How do we make the execution of these recovery plans an opportunity for young people to find their way back to the job market?
And when will we see the impact of this? And when will we see these young people getting on the job market after these plans, of course, are implemented?
Well, that's the very positive thing of these investment plans, is that it goes back to the Keynesian theory, where basically if you want to stimulate the economy, you have to do it as fast as possible after the shock that has generated the recession. So the shock is the pandemic, and so we have to invest as soon as possible. And so the Commission has put a deadline of 2026 for the execution of all the projects. And of course, when we were drafting it, it was kind of a race to invest as soon as possible. So to shift the investments towards the beginning of the time window. So we invest, I believe, 60% of the amounts we receive from the EU in the first 3 years. So by the end of 2023, 60% of the projects will be deployed.
So not a minute to waste. I mean, with China booming and the US accelerating, Europe really needs to get going.
No, for sure. And I mean, if you look at what the US are doing, I studied in the US. I have many friends in the US, and there is a huge opportunity, but also a huge risk for Europe. And today, the risk that we don't do enough for our recovery strategy is 10 times bigger than the risk of having a budgetary issue. And we have to realize that, and it requires a complete paradigm shift in the way we consider public investment in Europe.
And what about that catchphrase, the gender equality? It's something that's been coming up a lot lately. How did you keep that in mind? How were you mindful of that as you were drafting these proposals?
No, completely. We have in Belgium something we call Institut pour l'égalité entre les femmes et les hommes. So it's the Gender Observatory Center for Belgium. And what we did is that we partner with them, even though we had a very short time frame to draft the plan. We partner with them. And it was the first time we did it actually in Belgium. It's the first time we send them the entire list of projects, and we ask them to classify the project into what are the projects that can have negative impact on gender equality, what are the projects that can have a positive impact, and what are the projects that are neutral. And our objective was to have 20%, was to have 0 projects that would reinforce the inequality, and at least 20% that would contribute positively to the fight against gender inequality. And so we work together with them to make sure that we comply with these objectives, and it will have a very deep impact on how we implement these projects. For example, in the construction industry, it's a big challenge because 60% of our projects are infrastructure projects. But we know that the construction sector is a sector where you find 95% of men. So how do we get more women into the construction industry? That's a big challenge that we're trying to address also with the key players in the industry.
Of course, and that starts from getting younger women when they're young, studying engineering and all that as well. And then that final point on inspiring entrepreneurship. What have you to say about that?
Well, there also we have specific measures because what's important to keep in mind is that these recovery plans, it's of course investment, and everyone, including politicians, like to talk about investment because it's easier to talk about investment than to talk about reforms. But you have also reforms in these investment plans, and it's I would say, a very important moment for the Commission because it's one of the first time in the history of the EU where they were actually having some leverage to push reforms. And they had kind of a very good incentive on member state to pass the reform, because there is always the threat that if you don't do the reforms, you don't get the money for the investment projects. And some of the reforms we are leading within the framework of our investment, of our recovery plan, are related to entrepreneurship. And how can you remove some of the barriers? How can you give additional incentive to young people to actually start a business or a non-profit or whatever they want to do to fulfill their dreams? And it was very important in the way we address the reforms.
But I guess, Thomas, we'll never have a Google or a Facebook made in Europe unless we see more harmonization of laws and of tax cooperation rates and stuff. What would you say about that? I mean, that you've studied in America, you know the country well. When can you see a
No, for sure. And I would say that, especially coming from Belgium, I mean, we are a very small state, a great state, but a very small member state by its size. And if you want to build these kind of players, you need scale. Belgium doesn't have scale. Even the big member states, France, Germany, and so on, they don't have the scale to build a gigantic company like the Chinese or the Americans can do it. So it's very important, actually, that we have European coordination on that front. I had an exchange yesterday with Commissioner Breton about his industrial policy, and I think definitely that we should do it. And I even give him the idea to say, look, we have now a recovery facility, Next Generation, which is about 750 billion. We know it's not enough if we want to compete with the size of the plan of the Americans. So why not do a second round? But instead of giving it to the member states, you use it to support a very ambitious industrial strategy at the European level. So basically, how do you build the SpaceX, the European SpaceX? How do you build the big tech European company? I think that too often in Europe, we are afraid of ourselves and we don't realize that actually we are an economic giant. And so if we act together, we can do it. And so we have a tremendous opportunity to actually raise a second fund, which is not a fund distributed to member states, but a fund which is kept at the European level to lead very ambitious industrial projects in Europe.
Yeah, there seems to be a culture, isn't there, a little bit in Europe where we're afraid to fail. We won't take the risk that our
and it's also a question of, and you know, I like the American-European cross perspective, because we have the impression in Europe that we are the bad social democrat and the American are the liberal, they are against protectionism and so on. But actually, it's the opposite. American people are much more protectionist and they are leading a much more strategic industrial policy than we do. And so we must not be afraid of ourselves. And I believe that if we want to rebuild in European industrial capability, if we want to re-internalize some of the value chains which have been displaced elsewhere in the world, we have to do it very aggressively. And we have now, with the situation post-corona crisis, a very good momentum to lead ambitious programs. And so I was very happy to read the strategy of Commissioner Breton, but I think that now it needs financial means to execution.
Okay, good motto this afternoon. We must not be afraid of ourselves. Indeed, and just going back, Thomas, to the Next Generation EU plan that was adopted last year after what was an excruciating, polarising debate about rule of law and the conditionality, do you think that was just much ado about nothing in the end?
I don't know, and the next weeks will be very important, because actually now I think that most of the European countries have submitted their plans. I can tell you from Belgium that we are having a very intense discussion with the Commission on technical details, but also some specificities of the plan. And the idea is to submit those plans to the European Council this summer. And so now the big question is, okay, how are the discussion within the Council happen? Because some of these issues that you raised are still not solved.
But do you think it's a good tactic that the EU should use, that the member states should use, to bring countries like Hungary and Poland in line when they're scraping away at the fundamental rights and the fundamental values of the project that they signed up to be members of?
No, completely. I think that the European Commission has long been a dog that barks but does not bite. And with the recovery and resilience plan, the dog can also bite because if you don't comply to a certain number of rules, including the rule of law for a specific country like Hungary, you don't get the funds. And we know that for countries like Hungary, those funds are very important and are relatively big in comparison with their GDP. So they have a clear incentive to pass regulation which is compliant with the values of the EU.
Absolutely. Another question I wanted to ask you was this fund, so the Next Generation EU is probably sufficient for a minimum degree of stabilisation, but it's not really a stimulant, many would argue. So the question is there a case for Next Generation EU number 2 already?
Yeah, so I think you must differentiate what happens at national level versus the European level. At national level in Belgium, we are lagging behind in terms of public investment. We are at the rate of 2.5% of our GDP in public investment, and the European average is around 3.5. So we have a plan to catch up by 2024 with 3.5%. And the EU funding, it's roughly 6 billion, is a big kick, but is insufficient to reach our target of 3.5. So our government, the regional government in Belgium and the federal government will supply an extra boost of public investment to reach this target. At the European level, I think that we must not compare the size of the American plan and the European plan, because you can't compare, you must compare apple with apples. And actually, if you compare with the American plan, you need to make the sum of the investment at national level and federal level. Even though I believe that even though you would compare apple and apple, you would see that actually the stimulus in Europe is smaller than the American stimulus. Hence the question to give an extra boost. I think that France and Germany have raised the question, and they will find, I think, a lot of support in a lot of member states. And I believe that why not making this second package of stimulus as a European stimulus, so not shared between the member states, but to lead ambitious industrial policy at the European level. I think it's an amazing opportunity, and it's a great way to push Europe forward.
And Thomas, for me, there is an obligation to consult stakeholders, so local governments and social partners, about the absorption of the Next Generation EU funds. But how can it be guaranteed, and how can you make sure that this consultation is actually meaningful and doesn't just result in delays at the same time?
Well, I find it very interesting, the discussion we have with the Commission on the operational detail of the investment project. So we are in the templates that are provided with from the Commission, we have to detail every single project very precisely. So we have to say, okay, if you want to build a new infrastructure, you have to nearly month by month describe what you're going to do. And I think it's very much needed, because as said before, if you want to have an impact on the recovery post-COVID, you need to invest fast. So it's a kind of a disciplinary rule of the Commission to actually follow your targets. Then indeed the big question is the question you ask: what happens if you don't deliver? And will you expose member states to financial difficulties because actually they run out of schedule? And we know that actually in Belgium, for example, a lot of the extra demand we were facing in the construction sector, so also for big infrastructure projects, has been absorbed by workers coming from other parts of the EU, especially from Eastern Europe. In Belgium, on the main construction works, you will always find a lot of people from Eastern Europe. But what will be very specific in the coming months is that actually even those countries in Eastern Europe will also have a construction boom, because they will need to execute on their own construction projects. So this will be a challenge, and for me, it's a bit it's a big question mark. I mean, how will react the construction sector in front of all these big infrastructure projects.
Yeah, I mean, time will tell, Thomas. Time will absolutely tell. We do have some comments and questions coming in, so I'm going to bring them in. We've one from Lazo Ander saying, dog barks but did not bite. Lazo Ander, of course, we wanted to see earlier, but we didn't. The former Commissioner for Employment, so knows the Commission well. He says, unfortunately, under Jean-Claude Juncker, they did not even bark. The very cynical Juncker was part of the cover-up orchestrated by the CDU and the CSU. So there you go. Thanks so much, Lazo, for that input. We might see you before we wrap up this session as well. And we have a question now, Thomas, coming from Eric Kemp, saying that he was in contact with the Commission recently about their upcoming pilots with Mastodon and PeerTube. These are already existing and functioning open source and decentralized alternatives for the current corporate social media platforms. Is FEPS already aware of the next generation internet projects such as these and other funded NGIs, so next generation internet? I don't know if you can tackle that question.
Well, it sounds like a very interesting question, but I must say, Eric, to be very honest with you, I have no clue, and I have not heard of any project in that direction. But if you have a note on this, I would be very. I mean, it's a topic which is of great interest to me. So feel free to send it along, because I think it's indeed a big issue for Europe on how we get diversification from the American social media platforms.
Okay, and Thomas, we have a couple more minutes, so I want to ask you kind of what's your to-do list for the next couple of years? What do you really want to get done?
Well, as you know, I have two responsibilities within the government. One is the execution of the recovery strategy. 50% is linked to the European funds through Next Generation. So we will make sure that we follow up on the delivery of the project, and 50% is new projects that we need to initiate with Belgian funding. So there will be a lot of challenges to not only select the projects, but also ensure that the delivery of the project is smooth and well. The other part of my job is also very passionating, is scientific policy. So how to boost and basically give the best direction to Belgian research in universities and also in research centers. I'm also responsible for the space policy of Belgium, and I believe that space policy is also going to be very important for the future, with very important challenges for Europe, as we see that the Americans and the Chinese are moving very fast. How do we react in Europe? And it's very important if we want to keep some kind of sovereignty in the space. No, a lot of very interesting things to do. And I think that we are at a very important moment because, as you said in the introduction, the crisis has exacerbated some of the inequalities that were existing before the crisis. And if we are not able, as a social democrat, and you know I'm a member of the Socialist Party, but if we are not able to cope with the consequences of those inequalities, if we are not able to push a radical measure to reduce those inequalities, I believe that we will see very important turmoil in our societies across Europe.
And what have you learned from the pandemic that you can bring in now to your work?
I've learned three things. The first one is I think that we all have experienced what a collective shock is. We talk a lot about climate change, we talk a lot about these issues, but it's always a bit abstract and we don't feel the real consequences of it. And I think it's the first experience in the history of mankind that actually we make the experience of what does it mean actually to have a shock which impact all of us in our daily life. And so there will be consequences of it, because actually if we are not able to cope with climate change, we will experience the same kind of shock repetitively in the near future. The second consequence is that, and it's a very important message for me as a social democrat, is we all felt the value of our commons. We felt the value of having social protection against external shock, we felt the value, and we still feel the value of having a well-funded public health system. And so I believe that today, Conor Rousseau, who is the president of the Flemish Socialist Party, said, in the aftermath of the coronavirus crisis, everybody is a socialist. But indeed, actually, in Belgium, you won't find anyone who will say that social protection is not needed, because actually every worker, every firm has received a massive supply of public funding. And the third consequences, which I believe will be very important also on the European stage, is that we challenged very deeply some of the budgetary paradigm which actually put a hold on public investment. And the same people in the very same office in the administration of the Commission who are actually putting a limit on public investment of the member states are now giving incentive to the member state to invest massively in the infrastructure. And I think it's very important for the future that we always keep in mind that public infrastructure is not public spending. It's investment in the future, investment in making our societies much more resilient and much more future-proof.
And Thomas, like, what would you think would the similarities be between the COVID-19 pandemic and the financial crisis of 2009?
It has nothing to do. It has nothing to do for two reasons. One, the depth of the crisis is completely different. I think if you look at the GDP variation, we had contraction of the GDP, which were 5 or 6 times bigger with the pandemic. And it has nothing to do because the nature of the economic shock is completely different. In 2008, it was a financial crisis with implication on the monetary policy and the sovereign stability. Here, it's a shock on the supply side. It's actually measures we took to contain the pandemic that had a negative impact on the supply side. And so the nature is different, and that's the reason why the response must be different. And that's why public investment are much more needed now, because actually you need to reignite growth by putting additional money in the economy. And yeah, so the nature is completely different.
Okay, well, Thomas, just to wrap up, I want to ask you what your call to Europe is. What would be your big message that you want to give to European commissioners and, of course, EU leaders sitting in various member states? I know you spoke yesterday to Thierry Breton, but if you could stand up and give a big pitch to them all, what would it be?
Well, first of all, the risk of not doing enough for the recovery policy, for the recovery measures, is 10 times bigger than the short-term budgetary risk. If we don't do enough in comparison with what the Americans are doing, we will have inflation in the coming years with lower growth rates than elsewhere in the world. And so we will accelerate the divide between sluggish Europe and the other parts of the world. So this is very important. Secondly, is don't forget inclusiveness. This crisis will have major impact on the acceleration of inequalities, and we are now at a very important moment to pass important reforms, also on the fiscal side, to have much more progressivity in the fiscal regimes. And the third message is the one I said before, is if we do a second next generation fund mechanism, to be more ambitious, to be more bold, to be faster, why not do a mechanism at the European level to lead very ambitious industrial policy at the European level?
Okay, Thomas, I like your sense of urgency. It's a sense of urgency I think we need to feel a little bit more around Europe. So thank you so much for that. I've also been invited to give my call for Europe. I'll keep it very brief, but it's very similar to yours when it comes to inclusivity. And it's just really calling on commissioners, calling on policymakers, lawmakers, MEPs, politicians from national governments, to just get out of their bubble, to just take a walk around their cities and speak to the people, let people feel like they're being listened to. Because if you're going to create for a policy for people, the people need to be involved, they need to feel involved. And I feel like as a reporter, we've traveled all around Europe here at Euronews, and the main complaint that people always have is that they don't feel listened to. They feel that they're just being left out of the discussions. So I really feel that, you know, we can all perhaps break out of our bubbles and create more inclusive societies. But look, Thomas, thank you so much. That was so insightful. Thomas Dardine, the State Secretary for Scientific Policy, Recovery Programme and Strategic Investments at the Belgian Federal Government. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you all for watching. Now at 5 past, we're just on time. You can stay tuned and enjoy the next session, which will be moderated by Ayanara, who's a former journalist who used to be based here in Brussels, but she's now the head of comms over in Spain. And her session will be called Ring, Ring Europe, Mind the Regional Gap. And she will be featuring the European Commissioner for Cohesion and Reforms from Portugal. That's, of course, Elisa Ferreira. But for me, Maeve McMahon, thank you so much and have a great afternoon and best of luck with the rest of the conference. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.